streaming? Yep. Attention. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're ready for our next presentation. Again, thank you for coming to the Sony booth for NAB 2018. We've been giving presentations here on this small stage throughout the day, and our next presentation is going to be given by Doug Jensen. And we're going to be talking about the benefits of variable ND and how to best use it. So I give you Doug Jensen.
Is mic on? I don't hear it. Okay, I'm good. Okay. All right. Who wants to learn about variable ND? Step closer. Come on in here. Don't be shy. Come on. So, how many people have heard of variable ND before? So, a few people have heard about it. How many people have used it before? All right. So, I'm going to tell you what you need to know about variable ND because this is one of the coolest camera technologies to come around in a long time. And at some point in the future, when you've got it on your next camera, you're going to say, how did I ever live without this before? And it's that revolutionary, really. So let's talk about exposure on a camera first. On the camera, we have basically three controls that control exposure, right? We've got shutter speed, we've got gain, or ISO if you want to call it that, and then we've got the iris on the lens. The lens like this doesn't have an iris ring on it, but let's pretend it has an iris ring on it. So those are your three basic exposure controls. On a video camera, shutter speed needs to stay constant. We're not going to change the shutter speed if it's too bright out. We're not going to change the shutter speed up to 1/500th or something to reduce the light. Still photographers can do that. As video people, we can't do that because the shutter speed plays a direct role in motion blur, right? If the shutter speed's too fast, you're going to get a very choppy kind of a look, and it's not going to look like normal video. If you try to lower the shutter speed below the frame rate, you're going to have very blurry motion. So shutter speed is not a control that we want to change for exposure. So that's off the table. That leaves us gain. Well, if we're outside and we've got too much light, we can't really lower the gain. A few cameras can lower the gain, but that's not really a practical way to adjust the exposure on the camera. Normally, we want to have the gain set at 0 or the base ISO if you want to use that terminology of whatever the camera is. So that's not really an exposure control. So when you get right down to it, on most cameras, the only exposure control you really have is iris on the lens. So if we're outside shooting, we've got too much light, we can dial the iris of the lens down. But then what's the side effect of that? The side effects of changing the aperture on the lens is we have less light coming in, but we've also changed our depth of field. So if I'm going to have a camera like this with a super 35mm sensor, one of the reasons I'm getting a camera like this is with super 35 sensor, putting up with using lenses that don't have long zoom ranges and stuff. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to usually get shallow depth of field, whether that's for an interview or product shots or even outdoors. I want to separate the subject, whatever that subject is, from the background and foreground with depth of field. Well, if I have to iris the lens down to f8 to get my exposure or something, then I've destroyed all my chances of getting shallow depth of field. So ideally, I would like to keep my lenses open full wide. Whatever lens is capable of, whether it's f2.8, 1.4, f4, whatever it is, I generally want to shoot with the lens wide open. That's a creative choice that I have made. I want to make a creative choice that I want to shoot with the lens wide open. But the camera may not allow me to do that because that may cause an overexposure of the picture. So, on most video cameras, you're all familiar with ND filters. Sometimes that's a slide dial, sometimes that's a rotated one like this. Most video cameras have at least 3 ND filter positions. So we roll that, it rolls in a piece of glass in front of the lens, and that's like putting sunglasses on the camera, reduces the amount of light coming in. So 1 click, maybe 2 stops of ND. Another click, maybe 6 stops, depending on the camera and how you have it set up. But you're making these big jumps from like 2 stops to 4 stops to 6 stops, and never is one of those the right setting. You're always going to have to go put a little bit less ND in than you would ideally like, so you still have some room to maneuver the aperture on the lens. So, imagine if you had a camera that you could just dial in the exact precise amount of ND that you wanted to use and didn't have to have those big jumps. I call variable ND like the Goldilocks mode, because I don't have to have it a little too much, a little too not enough. I can dial in the exact amount of ND that I want to. So, let's talk specifically about the FS5 here for a second. If I have it in the traditional mode of ND filters, I can just turn this and I can put in 2 stops, 4 stops, 6 stops, whatever I want to. Okay, that's the normal way of using the ND. Or I can turn it to the variable mode, and now when I turn it to any of the 3 settings, now I have a dial wheel here on the side of the camera that allows me almost like a dimmer control on a light. Imagine we've all probably using LED lights now in our lighting and know how they all have dimmers on them so you can get just the precise amount of light that you want. Imagine having that same control on the camera. That's what we have now. So I say, okay, I'm outside shooting a bright light, I want to put in some ND, I click it to one of these settings, put it on the variable mode, and I can dial this wheel down, and I can put in the exact precise amount of ND that I want to put in. There's no color change, there's no artifacting, there's no vignetting around the edges, because I'm sure that people have heard of variable ND filters where you take 2 polarizers on the front of the lens and turn those against each other, and you can darken the amount of light coming in by using 2 polarizer filters. That's a crappy way of setting exposure. It has it changes how the skies look, you have a lot of vignetting around the edges. We're talking about variable ND on these cameras, we're talking about electronic variable ND filters, where it's actually a filter, a glass filter in the camera that actually varies, it's an electronic system where it varies the opacity of that piece of glass in very small increments. So small that you can't even really see it changing. It is like a dimmer. I don't want to say it's completely stepless, because I've seen some steps on it before in the past. I didn't mention it before, but I'm an independent freelancer. I don't work for Sony, so I own these cameras. I use them all the time. I buy them out of my own wallet. So I will tell you the truth. And it's not quite completely stepless all the time, but it's almost invisible on the changing, like a dimmer on a light. So, that's one way of using the variable ND. Another way of using the variable ND is because let's say I don't want to have to vary this every time I want to change the ND. I just want to still have presets here that I can just click in and add 2 stops or 6 stops or whatever. I can go into the menus and I can change those settings on here, those click stops. So as the camera comes from the factory, maybe ND position number 1 is 2 stops. Well, maybe I never use 2 stops. Maybe I want to make it 3 stops or 4 stops. So I can go into the menus and I can change those to anything that I want them to be if I don't want to use the variable ND as a completely variable ND like an ND, like a dimmer control. Another way that I can use it is I can set it to be on automatic variable. So let's say I'm doing a documentary, I'm shooting indoors, and the subject is going to step outdoors or into some place with brighter lights out on the stage. It's going to be much brighter out there. I want that ND filter. I don't want to click in an ND filter because then you see that big jump. I can put it on auto ND, and without adjusting the exposure with the aperture on the lens, which of course is going to change my depth of field and the look of the shot, I can leave my aperture alone, put it on variable ND, follow that person outdoors or wherever, and the ND filter will automatically track and change and keep the light levels consistent that are hitting the sensor. So very powerful function. So I've got some video here that I'm just going to roll. I'll be around the corner after I'm done with this, so I can, with the variable ND is on some of the cameras over there. In fact, now this is slightly outdated here now. In addition to the FS7 Mark II, FS5, X180, and X160, the 2 new cameras that are announced yesterday around the corner, the Z190 and the Z280, they both also have variable ND control also. So you can see here, just dialing in, this would be the equivalent of just turning the knob there and dialing in as much exposure as you want to. So the rest of this is just stuff that I've shot using the variable ND on my FS7, where pretty much everything I'm shooting is whatever the lens can open up to. So that's an f2.8 lens, f2.9 lens, I guess, on that one. And so as I'm outdoors shooting, I can take advantage of that of the super 35mm sensor, open up the lens all the way up to minimize my depth of field, and I don't have to worry about how much light there is. I'm going to use the variable ND to dial in exactly the level of light hitting the sensor that I want to use creatively. So variable ND, I look at as being a great creative control, because now I can choose my f-stop creatively wherever I want to and not be forced by the camera to drop it down to f5 or f5.6 or something just to get exposure. So that's the bulk of variable ND. Any questions? May want to take a look at the camera? Yes.
Is there a function called auto ND?
Yes, we talked about auto variable ND. So I'll just talk about that again for a second. There's not a lot to say about it. It's such a simple feature, you can't spend half an hour talking about this. So again, variable ND, for those that just came on, what we can do is we can set the aperture, the shutter speed, and the gain, leave those alone, don't touch them, turn it to variable ND, and then as we move from bright light to dark light and indoors and outdoors, the variable ND will actually change the opacity of the glass behind the lens there, steplessly, so you don't even see it changing, and just hold that exposure all the way through. It's quite an amazing feature. Like I said, if you don't have variable ND on your camera yet, someday you're going to have it, and you're going to look back and say, how did we ever get along without this previous to this? It is a Sony-only technology. No one else is going to have this feature. And you're not going to find it on the mirrorless cameras either or something. You're going to find it only on the true camcorders. If you're a video professional, please use a camcorder. Any other questions? Yes?
What is the difference between this? I guess there's been an upgrade on this because they're calling it the M2 or 2. What else is on there?
On the FS7 or the FS5? I'm not that familiar with the new version of the FS5. Yeah, okay, we'll answer those later. Okay, sorry. So how the range of the variable ND. So the variable ND, the least amount you can add is 2 stops. So that's one caveat that we've got. We can't just go from 0 all the way to 120, all the way to 7. So we can go from 2 stops to 7 stops. We can't go from 0 to 7 stops. So that's just the nature of the beast. I don't think that will ever change. It'd be nice if we could go from 0, but 2 ND stops is the least amount that you can add in. But once you get beyond those 2 stops, you can dial it up and down as far as you want to, all the way up to 7 stops, which is quite a bit of ND. Anything else? Any other questions? Like I said, variable ND is on some of the cameras over here, and if you step around the corner, you can see the newest cameras, the Z180, Z280, sorry, and Z190. Both of those have variable ND on them, and you could put your hands on them, give them a try, and see how it works for yourself, because it really is a fantastic technology. Questions?
How much is the retail price, list price?
Depends on which camera. Like the FS5 here, I believe the street price is around $4,700 for the body only, around $52 or $53 with the stock lens on it. And then the other cameras around the corner, depends on, it depends on which camera you're talking about, because this is, the variable ND is going to be coming out on more and more cameras. Yeah.
So it starts around, starts at...
This camera would start around $4,700 for the body only. But some of the cameras, they're like the Z190 around the corner, that's about a $4,000 camera for that.
Now here's a really strange question. I have like an EX1
Yep.
discontinued.
Just wrap up the presentation.
Yeah, you
Okay, all right. Any other questions about variable ND? Anything? Okay, well thank you for coming out, appreciate it, and we'll wrap up the presentation. I'll be available for questions afterwards. Good?